Kia ora, this is Liz. Welcome to Dame's Blaze. If you haven't watched the intro video yet, can I suggest you go do that now so you know what's going on? If you have not subscribed yet or hit that bell icon, can I also suggest you do that now so that you get notified when a new video shows up? And if at the end of the video you have liked it, can I suggest you like and share it so that the word can get around? Today we are looking at John chapter 5, and we are reading today from verse 35, but we're going to concentrate on verse 36. So we're doing 35 and 36 now, and I'll read them to you now. He was the burning and shining lamp. That was John the Baptist, by the way. That's who the he is. He was the burning and shining lamp, and you were willing for a time to rejoice in his light. But I have greater witness than John's. For the works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do, bear witness of me that the Father has sent me. So Jesus is still talking, right? John the Baptizer testified to Jesus' personage. He stated quite clearly and without equivocation that he, i.e. Jesus, was the Lamb of God, the greater one to come and the Son of God. This was his witness, and it was a pretty awesome witness, and yet Jesus declares that he has a greater witness than that. So greater would be megas in Greek, and it means greater in the widest sense of the word, which is why it's translated variously as weightier or more substantial or more important. What it isn't is just larger in a volume sense. Jesus is a greater witness in the sense that the sun gives more light than a lamp. So does Jesus shine greater and brighter than John the Baptizer. This greater witness is based on his works. So works is a Greek word ergon, and it means work, task, employment, deed, or action. That's pretty straightforward. So his deeds, the things that he did, they were a witness of who he is. Now that's not difficult to get your head around because, well, that's how we judge people around us. In fact, it's kind of what we are told to judge people by their fruit, meaning it's the actions of people that tell us who they are. Good fruit comes from a good heart, bad fruit from a bad one, and so we can usually tell without much difficulty where someone is coming from by the way they act. Jesus' witness is greater than John's because it is stronger, more decisive, more evident, which is interesting because as obvious and strong as it was, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes generally didn't see it. It's like they just refused to see the evidence before their eyes, even as it stacked up, which is why I said last week this became a willful hardening of the heart. In my opinion, there's no other way to explain their behavior. They had accepted John the Baptizer, some of them enough to go and be baptized by him. You remember this, right? He called them a brood of vipers, but they were still there wanting to be baptized. So they accepted John at his word. And Jesus also spoke powerful words, so he could have just confounded them with his wisdom and left it at that, but he does not. He provides proof by way of his deeds. His deeds are greater than John's in many ways, but one of the most obvious that pertains to our lesson today was his miracles. John didn't do one single miracle. So even if Jesus had only done one, it would still be a greater work than John's. But he didn't do just one now, did he? He did multiple miracles, and they are not explainable by natural means. People try, but seriously, the attempts are pretty ludicrous. The walking on water one, there's all sorts of theories about how that could be done by natural means. Theory one, he could have been walking on the shore, and it just looked like it was the water to the disciples. Right, but he was walking in the middle of the night. Who warned them? So that doesn't make sense. There was theory two. There was a sandbar that was in the middle of the sea. Right, and no ships ever grounded on the supposed sandbar. Third theory, what if it was a mirage? Yeah, at night, over water. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Modern humans just try as hard as the Jews of Jesus' day to make his miracles mean nothing, but actually they can't. The raising of the 2-day dead Lazarus cannot be explained away by natural means. It is a divine sign which points to his divinity. Some religions want to have his miracles, that chuck out the divinity, and you really can't do that. The miracles he performed were a sign of his divinity, and they cannot be explained any other way. The actual act of the miracles was, however, not the only way that his witness is greater than John's. Just as the light, i.e. the sun, is greater than a lamp, so too Jesus' deeds shine much brighter and stronger than John's. A lamp gives a portion of light. It lights a small space around it. The sun's light lights the entire globe. John's light shone over a small portion of Israel. Jesus' light went out to the entire world, and it continues to shine some 2,000 years later. The deeds that Jesus did were given to him by the Father. That's what he says. That means God put in place deeds for Jesus to complete during his lifetime, including, but not exclusively, the cross. I say not exclusively because it is deeds, not deed. This shouldn't surprise us. The psalmist said, "All my days were written in your book and ordained for me before one of them came to be. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God." If our days are ordained and written in his book, then I imagine that Jesus's were too. And while we don't necessarily do everything that God wrote in our books, Jesus most certainly did. In fact, he tells us that he would complete or finish them all. So to finish is the Greek word teleio. It means to bring to an end, to complete, or to perfect. In its fullest understanding, it means to work through an entire process to reach the final phase, which is exactly what he said he'd done when he said it's finished while hanging on the cross. The works that he does are the testimony that it was the Father who sent him. He didn't just spring out of nowhere from his own whatever. Sent is the word apostello, and yes, I know we think of that as the apostles, but actually it's just a standard Greek word that means to be sent on a mission, to be commissioned. Jesus was commissioned by God. He then commissioned the disciples. He said, "Go into all the world and make disciples of all men." That was a commissioning. Now we carry on that commission in a sense, in this sense, and in this sense only, we're all apostles. John tells us his purpose in writing this book near the end. He even alludes to the signs. He says in John 20:30-31, "And truly, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." That means these deeds, as Jesus calls them, or signs, as John, our gospel writer, calls them, are evidence of two things. One, Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. Two, he is the Son of God. Son in both literal and metaphoric Jewish sense. That means he acts as the Father would act in any given situation. John's Gospel wasn't written to back up the other three. They all testified to each other. John uses Old Testament predictions and allusions to point to Jesus being the fulfillment of all that the Old Testament writers and prophets and kings had been saying and doing. He completes the circle of creation and even takes on the curse in the garden. That would be death, right? He was their Messiah. They really didn't need to look for another. When he tells the Pharisees that they will get no sign except the sign of Jonah, it's because he's already given them plenty of signs, if only they had hearts to see them. It's a constant cry throughout John that his works testify to who he is. Which is interesting, actually, because John only records 7 of the things that Jesus did, right? Water to wine, healing the nobleman's son from a distance, healing the paralytic, feeding 5,000, walking on water, healing the blind man who was blind from birth, and raising Lazarus. It seems kind of odd, to me at least, that John only records this handful, especially as he also records Jesus telling people that his deeds testify to who he is. On a number of occasions, you'd think then that he would have packed his gospel with miracles, but he doesn't. Perhaps it's not about quantity, but rather quality, and what those specific miracles are attesting to. We'll look at them all in detail when we get to them, but let's just do a quick, well, sort of quick overview here, right? So we had the water to wine, walking on water, the mass feeding. These are all creative miracles, right? They allude to Moses and the Israelites, both in Egypt and in the wilderness. Moses turned water to blood. Jesus improves on that one. Moses splits the water. Jesus walks on it. Moses called down manna from heaven. Jesus is the bread of heaven. See all these links, right? We have 3 healings. One which proves his omnipresence, and the other 2, which would be the healing of the paralytic and the blind man, predicted miracles of the Messiah. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, and then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. So that's Isaiah, and those are specific ideas of what the Messiah will get up to. The last is, of course, the raising of the dead, which I suppose technically could still be considered a healing miracle, I guess. It was also predicted that that would be something the Messiah did. This is from Hosea. I will ransom them from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. O death, I will be your plagues. O grave, I will be your destruction. Pity is hidden from my eyes. So, all in all, these 7, they're a bit of an eclectic collection, but do remember that this is still Jesus' defense against the working on the Sabbath and making himself equal with God charges, right? The deeds that he does are supposed to show or be a witness that the Father had sent him, thereby giving him the right to work on the Sabbath and to claim equality with God. There are some similarities between these 7. There is a fair bit of subtlety around them. For instance, only the servants knew how the wine had been sourced. Only the Father knew of the Jesus connection to the healing of his son. The cripple at the pool had no idea who healed him in the beginning. The first 3 then are almost undercover. As we enter the next 4, it's becoming more obvious who's doing the miracle, but then again, the miracle is often done in such an understated fashion that you could miss them if you weren't watching closely, right? I mean, when he turns the bread and the fish into a mass amount for everybody, you wouldn't know he'd done anything at all. It just kind of happened as it went, right? So there is a subtlety about these miracles that John chooses. Could be a clue as to why he chooses these ones. When God moves in a life, it's not always apparent what's going on. Sometimes we only notice in hindsight. In fact, I would say most times we only notice in hindsight. Of them all, sorry. Of them all, Lazarus was the most public of the deeds or signs that John records, and by then Jesus is actually very near the cross and needs to make his death an imperative to the Sanhedrin. So you have to ask yourself, is it the subtlety that makes John choose these 7? Could be. 6 of the 7 require actions from others to be performed. The servants must fill the water pots, the father must go home, the cripple must get up, the young boy must bring his fish and loaves, the blind man must go wash at Siloam, Lazarus must come forth. Only the amble across the waves is done without any prompting from anyone. And that is easily pulled out as it being a miracle that no one but Jesus actually needed. Although there is one aspect of that miracle that does require someone to do something, and that would be Peter. When he wants to repeat Jesus' miracle, he has to get out of the boat to do it, right? So is it the actions? Is that why John chooses these 7? Perhaps. It certainly teaches us that there is often a part that we must play in any miracle. We have an active role, not a passive one. Is there a pattern to the 7 that could help us get hold of John's motives? Well, there are 7 of them, and that's often a key number in Scripture, being the number of perfection or completeness. We could say then that John gives us a complete dossier of Jesus's confirming deeds. There is a small pattern if we break them into groups of 3, with the middle one being the feeding of the 5,000. The 2 groups of 3 start with a creative miracle, i.e. you've got water to wine in the first bunch and walking on water in the second bunch, and then followed by 2 healings. Both groups of healings have some subtle connections. Both the nobleman and the man born blind have to go somewhere. Both the cripple and Lazarus have to get up and walk. I mean, there are connections, but whether we're meant to make much of them or just recognize John's skill in moulding his gospel, I really couldn't tell you. John certainly likes to use patterns. We see this patterning again in the book of Revelation. But these things can be made too much of sometimes. I mean, sometimes we can make too little of them, and sometimes we can make too much of them. Humans love to look for patterns and think they found some great mystery when they discover them. Perhaps the middle miracle will help us. The midpoint of a group of 7 is often seen as a linchpin, so is it this time? Feeding masses of people, 5,000, it's not really an auspicious number. The baskets that are left are 12, which possibly is representative of the 12 tribes or the 12 apostles, one or the other. It's near Passover. Does this have some relevance? The questions are starting to stack up, aren't they? We're asking a lot of ourselves to try and nut out the mind of a writer who was writing in another language, in a different time, in a different culture, how are we to know really what John was trying to tell us? Scholars debate this kind of stuff till the cows come home, but perhaps we do not have to. I could rack my brains for another couple of millennia and still not fully get all the meat that's buried in John's Gospel. And I don't want to bog us down in the mire while we're trying to figure out something that ultimately might well be unfigurable. Why does John consider these 7 signs to be the deeds that will convince us of who Jesus is? They are certainly miraculous. They are certainly divine. They indicate his sovereignty over nature and mankind. They show his kindness and his care, even in the face of opposition and indifference. I am thinking of the cripple there. Perhaps that is all we need to know. Perhaps I will get the chance to ask John when I see him, although he may well be sick of that question. Until then, I think I'm going to have to leave this as a partially unanswered, partially answered question, that we may never fully understand this side of the grave. And maybe that shouldn't worry us too much. We need to have a few unanswered questions, if only to force us to dig in a little deeper. Perhaps by the time we finish the whole Gospel of John, we will understand better how John has used these 7 to prove his points. Till then, we must let God and the Spirit reveal it to us in their timing and not ours. As I've often said, faith requires unanswered questions. If you have all the answers, you don't really need faith. Here in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin refused to listen. Perhaps they could discount some of the earlier miracles as the ramblings of the masses, but when he healed this beggar, a known person in Jerusalem, one who had been there for 38 years, that was the end of them being able to pretend that the populace were lying to them, because this one was in their city. They probably knew the guy. This wasn't as secret as some of the other miracles that Jesus performed, and when he raises Lazarus, who doesn't live that far from Jerusalem, they can no longer disregard this guy. They ignored everything surrounding Jesus that testified to who and what he was, but we should not. And if we are challenged on our beliefs around Jesus, we should testify to his works and deeds just as he did. They are the sign of who he was, and even the early historian Josephus knew enough to call him a miracle worker. No historian disputes Josephus, so if they will not listen to the Bible, perhaps they will listen to him. As for you and your house, consider these 7 deeds that John records. What do they tell you personally about this God you serve? What do they testify to you? Is he sent of God? And if the answer is yes, what does that mean for your life? I'm leaving you with lots of questions this week, and that is all I have for you this week. So I hope that you have an awesome week. Do some thinking, do some pondering. You never know, you might come up with something. And if you do come up with something, put it in the comments, because you never know, we might all be able to nut it out together. As for me and my house, I'm off. Have a lovely week. Ka kite anō. I will see you next week.